Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto turns into a fox during a full moon. Pre-timescope, no Biju, Konoha is a village of ninjas who hunt demons. Naruto is a ninja with secrets. And tonight is the night of a full moon. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 57, Ill Wind. Kabuto slipped away after he'd escorted the last group of groggy civilians out of the stadium. The master that he'd long served in secret was no more, and now seemed to be the ideal time to move on. With all the chaos and destruction going on, when he was finally found to be missing, it would just be assumed that he had fallen victim to the invaders and likely devoured by spider demons. And once the doctor that he'd murdered and impersonated was finally uncovered, there was no way he'd be on the suspect list, not that there'd been much chance of that in the first place. I know of at least 2 of his hidden laboratories, Kabuto mused as he adjusted his glasses after slipping through the breach in the village wall. There should be plenty there to keep me busy for a long time. All that research. He shivered with delight and angled towards the forest of death, the least guarded path that would lead him towards his new home. I wonder if I should keep my Konoha Hitaiate or Orochimaru's mole never saw the kitsune that decapitated him from behind. Stupid Konohanin, the charcoal grey Kurikoa vixen sneered, flicking the blood from the tip of her tail before she relaxed it blade shape. What a lousy scout. All alone and totally oblivious to possible ambush. If he hadn't been heading towards Yuta-sama, I wouldn't even have wasted my time. With a snort of contempt, she faded back into the shadows and kept vigilant for any other stupid humans that might interfere with the ritual. Naruto hesitantly peeked between his black furry fingers and saw that Sasuke seemed to have stopped melting. Patches of his skin was still gray and unhealthy looking, and one of his hand wings hadn't completely vanished, but otherwise he looked like himself again. The fox boy slowly lowered his paw hands and contemplated whether or not to poke his unconscious teammate to see if he'd wake up. Perhaps he ran out of chakra, Shino suggested between wheezes as he shuffled closer with Shikamaru's help. If his transformation required a steady stream of chakra to be maintained, he should have collapsed sooner if that was the case, Shikamaru grunted. There's no way he has enough chakra to have lasted as long as he did. Something else must have stopped him. Shino braced his shoulder against a tree trunk and looked exceptionally pale as he put his shades back on. Shikamaru sighed, shoved his hands into his pockets, and tilted his head back to stare up at the leafy canopy that blocked his view of the sky. Naruto picked up the stick he'd dropped in his panic and used it as he'd intended to poke Sasuke. And Sasuke remained out cold, face down in the dirt. Quit poking him, Shikamaru sighed when he saw what Naruto was doing. It's probably best that he stays asleep. There's no telling what his state of mind will be when he wakes up. Naruto pouted a bit and tossed the stick aside. He shook himself a bit in a rather canine manner and glanced around at the surrounding forest. Wrinkling his wet black nose, he inhaled. I smell fox. I don't know this fox. The fur on his back bristled and he whirled around, sniffing in search of the fox smell. It could be nothing to worry about. Or it could be. Hey, there are some kids over here. A distant male voice exclaimed. All of Naruto's fur fluffed in alarm. Over where? An even more distant male voice called back. A clump of bushes several yards away rustled and a large orange fox head popped into view. Over here, stupid. It yelled over its shoulder. Shino lurched upright with a pained gasp. Shikamaru stared, his usual bored expression replaced with one of naked shock. And Naruto whirled to face the fox head on all fours with his back arched like a frightened cat. How many, and what affiliation? The second speaker sounded closer now. And don't call me stupid. 3 no, 4. The orange kitsune replied as it slunk into clear view. He was in fox form, but still fully clothed with his sandals tucked into his belt. 4 black-tipped tails swayed behind him. At least 3 of them belong to Konoha. And you'll never guess who one of them is. Naruto scampered backwards, trampling his own tail until his back hit a tree trunk. He'd been recognized and now he was in deep trouble. Kitsune had either ignored him, sneered at him, or been out for his blood. They're gonna kill me and skin me and eat me. His claws convulsively dug into the tree at his back as he tried to melt into the massive plant to escape. "Mommy, help! What are you talking about?" A second kitsune head popped out of the bushes. Oh! The second kitsune was completely identical to the first one. Its clothes were the same, its fur and eye color were the same, it had the same number of tails, its voice sounded the same, and it even smelled the same. The two demon foxes might well have been clones. "Would you calm down?" the second fox suggested. "He looks like he shoved his finger in a light socket." The first snickered. The second lightly whacked the first in the head with one of his tails. Naruto barely heard either of them. Panic choked his thoughts and a surge of adrenaline urged him to bolt. But with his back pressed into the tree he felt cornered and trapped, so he just kept futilely trying to merge with the tree trunk. "Troublesome," Shikamaru muttered. "And here I thought that things were going our way." "This is a most unfortunate turn of events," Shino quietly agreed, his voice taut with pain. The first fox glanced towards the two genin. "You kids say something." "What is this?" the second asked, tentatively sniffing at the unconscious Sasuke. "One of Orochimaru's pet freaks." "Is it?" the first demanded of the Nara and the Aburame. "If it is, we'll kill it for you." Shino's swarm had reformed and was now buzzing ominously around him, and Shikamaru's eyes darted back and forth between the two foxes as if determining which one was the better target to go for first. "Come on, we know you can talk," the second snorted. "So tell us," the first said. Neither boy said a word. "Ah, perhaps they've been trained not to speak to strangers," the first concluded with a grin. "So, allow us to introduce ourselves. I am Enitora, and this is my brother, Ichitora, and we are part of Clan Uzumaki. Now, who might you be?" "Baka," the second fox, Ichitora, sighed and rolled his jade-colored eyes. "Naruto," he turned to the panic-stricken fox boy, "please calm down and explain the situation to us." Naruto was panting raggedly as his heart raced in his chest. The fog of fear was starting to roll back, though. The kitsune seemed to be talking to him, not trying to kill him. Perhaps they were friendly? Uzumaki. His claws slowly kneaded the tree bark at his back. "They're relatives?" "I forgot, you can't talk like that," Ichi sighed. "How about we play 20 questions? He waved a black forepaw at Sasuke. "Is that an enemy?" It took a moment for him to process the question, but then Naruto emphatically shook his head. "Then is he some kind of victim?" Naruto nodded energetically. "Does he belong to Konoha?" Again Naruto nodded and he slowly relaxed his grip on the tree behind him. "Okay," Ichi exhaled and looked Sasuke over thoughtfully. "Okay. Hey Naruto, get your friends to calm down, would you?" Eni requested. "I think they're thinking of doing something dumb." He peeked over to the right and cringed. Shino and Shikamaru looked braced for battle, but even if they weren't hurt and tired they didn't stand a chance against the kitsune. They probably couldn't even hope to fight one of them, let alone the two of them. Naruto peeled his back from the tree, shuffled a bit closer to his genin comrades, and made a clumsy calming gesture. "Naruto," Shikamaru said tensely, "I thought you were supposed to be a werewolf." The fox boy's shoulders slumped in dismay at the Nara's suspicious look. "Oh, he is." Eni nodded. "And he isn't," Ichi added. "Our poor nephew is what you get when a kitsune hooks up with a werewolf," Eni continued. "Nephew?" Shino repeated, quirking an eyebrow. "He's disowned," Ichi shrugged, "but it was better than killing him," Eni shivered. "Killing kids is not cool. Not to mention Imuto would have gone nuclear if the clan had really given in to the pressure," Ichi added. "Aren't you an endangered species?" Shikamaru frowned. "Why would you want to kill him?" "Never eat anything that can talk, and never have sex with anything that can't," Eni said gravely. "Werewolves can't talk and they aren't much smarter than dogs," Ichi elaborated. "Kushin and Achan's relationship with Naruto's father is viewed by our kind the same way that human society would look upon someone caught molesting a farm animal. And that stigma spilled onto him in addition to a bunch of other concerns." "We can talk," Naruto sulked, patting down his fear-fluffed fur. "You just don't understand what we say." "Enough talk about that," Ichi muttered. Come along, little genin. It's time to get you back to your village before something nasty finds you. Do we have to take this with us? I asked, sniffing at Sasuke. It almost smells like a gargoyle. Yes, Ichi informed his twin. The Hokage will decide what to do with it. Why should we follow you? Shikamaru demanded. Our history warns us not to trust you, Shino wheezed. The twin Kitsune sighed deeply in perfect unison. Naruto hesitated before he started to reverse his transformation and return to his human form. He vaguely recalled these uncles and how they'd never really been cruel to him, just oblivious to him. They hadn't tried to hurt him or his friends, and they'd taken his word that Sasuke wasn't some sort of deformed monster. So he would tentatively put some trust in them and let the adults take charge. Must we really argue history with you? Ichi asked tiredly. Can we really even argue? I sighed. We've been so vilified and stereotyped because of that demmed Cuba bastard. It's probably hopeless. You're starting to sound as bitter as Arashina-chan, Ichi chided. Tora stuck out his tongue at his twin. Naruto finished his change, adjusted his pants, pushed his hitayate back up to his forehead, and then glanced down at his bare feet. Hey, where'd I throw my sandals? All attention snapped to him. Why didn't you change back before? Shikamaru asked. I didn't think to, Naruto shrugged as he scanned his surroundings for his footwear. I was too freaked out. Do they speak the truth? Shino inquired. Naruto thought it over for a moment before nodding. He located his left sandal at the foot of a tree a couple of yards away. And the right sandal turned up in a clump of weeds. After he got his feet back into them, some questions exploded into his brain. Hey! He raced back to the group and pointed one finger at each fox. What are you doing here looking like that? That totally breaks all of grandfather's rules. Extraordinary circumstances, I answered and scratched behind one black ear with his back leg. Our village has been split between those who want to keep the peace and those who hunger for vengeance, Ichi continued. It's a good thing that we found you and not some fox following the Kurohi's leadership. They would have killed you instead of talked to you. They're all fools, I snorted, giving himself a shake. They want vengeance for all the old wrongs, but all the guilty humans are dead in dust. That's no vengeance, it's just feeding the cycle. There are bad foxes here. Naruto gulped and a chill raced up his spine. Yes, but don't worry, we won't let them get you, Ichitora assured him. Kushin and Achan would gut us like fish if we let any of them touch you, Tora shuddered. What about my friends? Naruto asked, nervously scuffing his feet. If they still want to be my friends, we'll look after them, too, Ichi promised. But only if they come with us. If they choose to stay behind, we can't guarantee their safety. Let's get a move on. I declared, pawing at the ground in impatience. We've got places to go and bad guys to smash. You should take human forms, Shikamaru suggested as he slowly relaxed into a more neutral stance. Otherwise you could be mistaken for the enemy, which would be troublesome. Good idea, Ichi nodded thoughtfully. I like you, I grinned. You're pretty smart. Thanks, the Nara boy frowned. I think. Hurry up, Ichi chided, already partway through his transformation, and therefore briefly discernible from his identical twin. Get changed so we can get going. I'm going, the second twin muttered. Shikamaru and Shino watched the two Kitsune change with fascination. Naruto just fidgeted with his fingerless gloves until his uncles had finished and put their shoes back on. Now ready to move on, Tora slung the unconscious and still sort of transformed Sasuke over his shoulder while Ichitora offered assistance to the limping Shino. I hope going with them is a good idea, Shikamaru muttered into Naruto's ear. Yeah, Naruto silently agreed, I hope so, too. An unseasonably cold blast of air rushed through the trees, making the canopy twist and groan high overhead. It made an eerie sound as it roared past, forcing chills up all their spines. It even managed to stir the sleeping Sasuke just slightly. And then, just as suddenly, the air was still again, like nothing had happened. It made Naruto yelp like a frightened puppy and he latched onto a rather irritated Shikamaru's arm. Well, that didn't feel good, Ichitora muttered, rubbing at his human arms. Not at all, Tora agreed. Let's hurry, kitties. That's a bad omen if I ever saw one. Mommy, Naruto shivered as he slowly removed himself from Shikamaru's arm. Where are you? Kushina padded through the eerie deserted hallways of the stadium, careful not to jostle her passenger. So far Mikoto had refused to stop and seek medical attention for her busted ankle. The Uchiha woman's mind was fixed on one thing and one thing only, find Sasuke. Everything else could wait. Hey, Kushina piped up. How about while we're looking for help in finding Sasuke, we find a medic to wrap up your foot? Mikoto ignored her. It seems like a really good idea to me, Kushina continued hopefully. I'm sure that a little bit of treatment would ease the pain in the long run. Mikoto tightened her grip on the scruff of Kushina's neck, but said nothing. Really, let's visit a medic while we're here, the vixen pleaded. It'll make it easier for me to carry you around. Let's just get into the arena, Mikoto ground out, her voice harsh with a mixture of pain and anxiety. Okay. After a few more turns and flights of stairs, they emerged into a significantly emptier stadium. It sounded like there was still a little bit of fighting going on, so Kushina moved cautiously towards the arena pit. But when they got closer they saw that a knot of kitsune were down in the arena, wrapped in a shield, and a dozen military police were attacking the barrier while the rest of the Konoha in there just stood by and watched. Great, Kushina sighed. Are they friend or foe? Mikoto hesitantly asked. I can't tell, I need to get closer, Kushina replied. She scanned the empty stands until something caught her eye. Hey, an aid station. Let's go there to get a better look while the medics fix your foot. Before Mikoto could argue, Kushina was slinking along, keeping her tails low to avoid drawing unfriendly attention from below. The handful of medics and their patients were settled on a broad landing between flights of shallow steps in the shadow of the highest part of the stadium complex. They flinched at the sight of a kitsune so close to them, but when Kushina gently used 3 of her tails to transfer Mikoto from her back to one of the stadium chairs, they hurried forward to tend to the Uchiha's injuries. While her friend was being worked on, Kushina put her focus on the fight down in the arena pit. It was an entirely one-sided fight, she soon saw. The Uchiha circled the hexagon-shaped barrier and occasionally launched assaults against it with little result. The kitsune just sat there behind the safety of their shield and watched, sometimes shouting insults but otherwise doing absolutely nothing. If they were the enemy, they would be fighting back, not huddling on the defensive, Kushina mused, twitching her 5 tails in thought. So I'm pretty sure they're on Konoha's side. And the only reason that this is going on is because some Uchiha showed up and picked a fight. The red fox hooked a paw over her muzzle, closed her eyes, and sighed. So it seems that the instructors were incorrect, a boy said. Kitsune are not extinct after all. Cracking open one eye, Kushina saw Hyuga Neji hovering a few feet away. The genin looked as stone-faced as the last time she'd looked at him. But now he had some gauze wrapped around his neck, which had to be the result of the chaos following the interrupted test. He had made it through his demon match completely unscathed. What happened to you? She asked. Neji gave her an icy stare. You might as well tell me, because I'm just going to keep asking, Kushina snorted. Then a better question occurred to her. Do you know where Naruto is? Neji remained silent. Answer me or I'll tickle you until you laugh, she threatened, brandishing her fluffy tails. I have the perfect tools for the job. The young Hyuga eyed her as if she was insane. I asked 2 simple questions, answer or face the consequences, Kushina growled, some of her anxiety bleeding through her cheery facade. I was ambushed by the Oto genin, Doso, Neji said reluctantly, his white eyes following the movements of her tails warily. My injury left me unable to follow Naruto and the others as they sought to catch Sasuke. So, Naruto could be anywhere in the village, and an easy target for any angry Uchiha. Her head drooped. Wonderful. What are your intentions? Neji demanded with a scowl. For today? I want to put a stop to this stupid fighting, find my son, go home, pig out on ice cream, and cuddle with my boyfriend. She stretched out like a dog until her spine popped and then raised an eyebrow at the long-haired human boy. What about you, sourpuss? Neji narrowed his eyes. Who are you? I'm Uzumaki Kushina. With a surprised blink, she turned to see Furukawa Kaito and a few other foxes descending from some higher level of the stadium. His form was almost completely human, with the only foxy feature being a single tail. The rest were fully fox, although they wore clothes that would allow them to turn human without being left naked. He glanced her over with a frown. "What happened to your clothes?" "Unfortunately they got destroyed," she sighed. "But the good news is that Byaku Chikashoku and Kurohi Udai are both dead." "Oh good," Kaito replied, fingering his shredded ear. "You killed both of them?" "No, but put me down for an assist," she said with a grin. "They got what was coming to them." Well, how many other enemy kitsune did you see?" he asked. "Only a few, and only at a distance," she answered after a moment's thought. Kaito didn't look very happy to hear that. "Kitsune are fighting each other?" Neji wondered aloud with a frown. "Sure," Kushina snorted over her shoulder at him. "Do you think humans have some kind of monopoly on killing your own kind?" Neji opened his mouth to answer, then shut it and looked away with a thoughtful expression. "Kushina." The vixen looked past Neji to see Mikoto hobbling over, her pale face grim and determined. All the field dressings she'd done for her minor wounds had been replaced by more professional efforts, and her busted ankle was bandaged and splinted. The medics didn't look happy to see her moving, but they hadn't been able to persuade her not to leave or sedate her. "Let's get going. None of them know where Sasuke is." "Okay." Kushina nodded slowly and positioned herself so that Mikoto could get on her back with minimum effort. "Hop back on. You're letting her ride you like a pony?" A violet-colored vixen by Kaito's side asked incredulously. "She's my friend," Kushina replied. "But she wears the Uchiha crest." A green-pelted fox sputtered. "Uchiha never befriend demons. They don't even like summons." "She's my friend," the Uzumaki repeated as Mikoto got settled so the fox could stand up. "You can find some good Uchiha if you look hard enough." "Good Uchiha?" A third fox snorted, flicking three fluffy tails. "Isn't that an oxymoron?" "Enough." Kaito snapped at them. "I'm sure that she's right about this woman. If we go around stereotyping the Uchiha like they do us, we aren't much better than them." Kaito's little Vulpin entourage looked properly chastised, and the jabs against the Uchiha clan's unfavorable reputation ceased. "Okay," Kushina breathed deeply, "we're going." "Stay, if you would please," the Hokage's voice interrupted. The old master hunter was slowly walking down the stairs towards the clump of medics and wounded ninja, flanked by at least 2 four-man cells of Umbu and his chief summon, the monkey chief Inma. It looked strange to see him wearing a black ninja suit and light armor instead of the traditional hat and red and white robes. He looked very old and very tired, but his steps were steady and he leaned on no one's support. "Hokage-sama," Kushina murmured and awkwardly dipped her head in a bow, careful to not unseat Mikoto. "Hokage-sama," Mikoto nodded her head and bit her lip. "I need to find my son." "I bet the Umbu could find him," Kushina piped up as sudden inspiration struck her. "They've got radios and they're all over the place." The old man glanced at one of his masked servants, and the elite ninja stepped aside to whisper into his radio, then signaled the answer to the Hokage. "He hasn't been seen," the Hokage told them, "but they will be on the lookout for him and will report his location as soon as he is found. Now, Mikoto-san, if you would do me a favor instead of running off." The dark-haired woman squirmed uncomfortably on Kushina's back before giving in. "How may I be of service?" "Could you try and persuade your clansmen to stop wasting their time and energy?" he requested, and gestured down at the military police who were still desperately trying to get past the kitsune's barriers so that they could slay the multi-tailed demons. Mikoto gave a slow nod. A cold blast of wind whistled into the stadium and swirled around the stands before blowing up and out. It seemed to carry a moaning growl and a heavy sense of menace. The mysterious gust rattled everyone, even the masked Umbu seemed to tense. Kushina's fur bristled and she flinched so badly that Mikoto almost slipped off. "What the hell was that?" she asked. It felt like the wind before a big storm, but the sky's clear. In one of Konoha's parks, the second biggest one, an old woman sat in the lotus position with her eyes closed beside a small pond. She wore shabby, patched clothing and most of her white hair was pulled up into 2 buns. There hadn't been much fighting in this area of the village, and it was eerily quiet now. It suited the old woman's purposes perfectly. All around her she could feel Konoha as it fought off the forces that sought to invade and despoil it. A handful of times since the fighting had started she had considered moving to intervene, but each tangle had resolved itself on its own. So she sat and observed and waited. She loved this village and she would protect it, but only if she was really needed. Her time here was long done, and although she had promised to keep it safe as long as she lived, it wouldn't do to make the leaf dependent on her. She would live a long time, but she wouldn't live forever. Perhaps I shall seek out my descendant tomorrow evening, she mused. She's come all this way to talk to me, so I shouldn't disappoint her. A chill wind howled through the park trees, causing their branches to sway and groan and shed dozens of leaves. Dark vibes rippled through the wind, pressing against the old woman's skin and stirring her loose hair. As it swept past her, her head snapped towards its source and her eyes squeezed closed tighter in concentration. She stretched her senses farther and farther and far. I was a fool to think this would end so easily. With a sad sigh the old woman stood and opened her eyes to stare in the direction of the forest of death. And they are bigger fools for waking that thing up. Chapter 58, Hellish Fires, Heavenly Chains. The forest of death now sported a bald spot in its dense canopy. A vast low mound of earth and shattered stumps lay bare to the clear sky. Dozens and dozens of poles coated in seal papers encircled the base of the mound. 9 sacrifices were staked equidistantly around the naked hill, still alive, but not for much longer. Really only 1 sacrifice was necessary, but with 9 the process would go much faster and the results would be much better. 9 lives, 1 for each tail, would revive the beast at full size and full strength in under a half an hour. A single life would bring it back small, weaker, and take longer. It might not even work at all. The Kyubi no Yoko was a weighty spirit and ancient. A single life, not even a kitsune's life, might not be enough to restore it. The 9 sacrifices had all been carefully culled from Uzushiagaku or no Sato. All of them, for some reason or another, would not be missed. Most were like the old man that Yudai had gifted to Orochimaru to ease the Hanyu into alliance with them, older creatures that had never been of much use to the clan or village. And 3 of them were unwanted spouses to Uzumaki and a Hoshitama who had had the great misfortune to marry into the unhappy Byakuchi and had not escaped with their birth clans. Useless or unwanted in life, they would serve an important purpose in death. Kurohi Yuta stood near the partly buried skull of the Kyubi no Yoko and dispassionately watched as one of the sacrifices slowly withered away. Pale wisps of life force flowed from the web of seals around the wilting kitsune into the giant demon's burial mound. The stump-covered hill trembled and shifted, and at the very start of the life-infusing ceremony a frigid blast of wind had exploded from it, radiating in all directions like ripples on a pond. Soon now. Several deep cracks split the earth of the mound like it was an eggshell, and raw-red energy slowly boiled out of them like lava. The air filled with the reek of charred bone, burned flesh, and singed fur. The crest of the mound cracked open and part of the blackened spine arched into view. Several trees in the distance groaned and toppled as a single massive tail, already covered in bristly red-orange fur, lifted into the sky. Arr. Yuta smiled even as his hackles rose at the heavy sense of malice filling the air. Very soon now. Mikoto nodded her fingers in Kushina's red neck fur as the kitsune slowly slunk down the thick concrete wall that ringed the sunken arena pit. A pair of umbu followed them several paces behind. And below, her clansmen and women circled the 6-sided barrier thrown up by a clump of allied kitsune, seeking for a weak point that they could exploit to get inside and attack the demons. Other Konoha Chunin and Jonin watched, but neither helped nor hindered the Uchiha. A few yards from the ground, Kushina detached from the wall and landed as lightly as she could on the grass below. The vixen paused momentarily before slinking around the main clump of Konohanin to give her and her passenger a clear view of the problem. The kitsune stopped a safe distance away and it was up to Mikoto to do the talking. Kentaro! Mikoto shouted once she determined that he was the highest-ranking Uchiha present. Stand down. There are other hotspots in the village for you and your people to deal with. The attacking Uchiha paused and looked her way, and their grimly determined expressions melted into horror. Mikoto-sama has been captured by the demons. A woman officer gasped. What? Mikoto wanted to slap her forehead. Of course. I'm riding a kitsune, so I must have been captured and put under their influence. Kentaro and another Uchiha possessed active Sharingan and they used them to perfectly aim kunai to strike the fox but leave her unharmed. Mikoto clenched her teeth and rapidly signed a Raiden Jutsu into existence. The shield of electricity acted like an electromagnet and wildly deflected the metal-throwing knives away. Enough. Mikoto snapped after she cancelled her electrical technique. I have not been captured. Mikoto-sama, Kentaro frowned in distress. Can't you see that you ride a fox demon and not an Inyazuka hound? I know precisely what I ride, Mikoto replied. She awkwardly slid off Kushina and hobbled a few paces away, closer to her clansmen. Hokage-sama wishes to deal with this situation personally. There are still many enemies out in the village that need dealing with. Move along. Leave and let a tired old man get the glory of killing Kitsune. A young officer, Kentaro's youngest brother Dataro, demanded angrily. No way. This quarry is ours. My brother has a point, Kentaro agreed. This is our hunt. No one else here has seen fit to join us. And we are Uchiha, we never give up on a hunt until we have our quarry in hand. There are plenty more where they came from out there, Mikoto insisted, fighting down a rising sense of frustration. And the enemies out there aren't securely tucked away behind any barriers. Well, I see one demon unprotected. Dataro grinned and charged with a Tonto knife in his hand. He zipped past Mikoto on a collision course with Kushina. But Dataro was one of the Uchiha who hadn't managed to awaken his Kekai Genkai, so he really didn't stand a chance. He was unable to predict the movements of Kushina's five tails, and the furry appendages easily tripped him up and tossed him back to his brother and comrades. Reckless, Kushina sniffed. How old are you? 14. 15. I'm 16. Dataro snarled as he stumbled back to his feet and scrambled to retrieve his dropped blade. Ah, small for your age, the vixen remarked. You're overcompensating. I'm sure that you'll hit your last growth spurt any day now. Shut up. Dataro howled, red-faced with humiliation. Quiet. Mikoto hissed over her shoulder. You're not helping. Sorry, Kushina shrugged. You're not Mikoto-sama, Kentaro said with a deep scowl. You can't be. You must be a transformed fox that's impersonating her. I'd forgotten that Kitsune are true shapeshifters in addition to being illusionists. Enough. The Hokage interrupted as he strode into view, shadowed by Umbunin and Inma. I had hoped that there would be less argument if my order to cease attacking the Kitsune and leave the stadium passed through Mikoto, but it seems that I was mistaken. His weathered face darkened. Or, will you accuse me of being a transformed Kitsune as well? Kentaro worked his mouth as if to protest before giving a stiff, sharp nod. We shall move on and report your orders to our superiors, the Uchiha said, and with a gesture to his subordinates they formed up and headed for the nearest exit. Once they were out of sight, Sarutobi sighed wearily and rubbed at his eyes. I'm sorry, Hokage-sama, Mikoto swallowed hard. I'm tired and worried about Sasuke. I haven't exerted much direct control over the clan. I let Fugaku manage everything so I could focus on being a mother. I shouldn't have had Kushina bring me down here. I didn't think things through at all. It's all right, the old man grimaced. You tried. Hokage-sama. The old hunter turned and moved to meet Inyazuka-tsame and her wolf-like dog Kuromaru and hear what they had to report to him. Mikoto sagged as a fresh wave of fatigue washed over her. She swayed and almost toppled before Kushina was back at her side and giving her some much-needed support. After a few deep breaths she was about to ask to be carried back up to the stands so that she could sit down when there was a tap on her shoulder. Excuse me, Mikoto-san, Hatake Kakashi greeted. But would your fox friend happen to be Uzumaki Kushina? She blinked at the masked Jonin before managing a nod. Yes, but how did you? I didn't think that there would be any other Kitsune that you would trust enough to ride, he replied rather cheerfully. But, what would make you think that she's a Kitsune? Mikoto wondered. Naruto's beast form is very atypical for a werewolf, he replied, crinkling his visible eye with a hidden smile. So, he glanced down at the vixen. Tell me, did Minato-sensei know about this? No, he didn't, Kushina answered, guiltily scuffing at the ground with a paw. He knows now, though. Kakashi went very still. He knows, now. Yep. Kushina nodded with a foxy grin. Kakashi-san, could you call upon your summons to find Sasuke? Mikoto asked hopefully. I don't have enough chakra to call the whole pack, he replied after a moment's thought. He drew a kunai and brought the blade to one of his fingers. However, I should be able to get Pakun. If you would please, Mikoto gulped as her voice wavered. An umbu intruded, interrupting before Kakashi could slice his finger open for the blood he needed for the jutsu. There is news, the lion-masked ninja said. Sasuke has been spotted on the fringes of the village. He is being brought back to the stadium. Ox and Wasp are shadowing. Relief almost made Mikoto gray out. Thank you. Who else is with him? Kushina asked. Naruto, Narashikamaru, Aburameshino, and 2 identical males classified as allied kitsune, the umbu promptly replied. Mikoto tightened her grip on Kushina's fur as a fresh wave of tension came over her. How do they know that they are allies? What if they're wrong? What? Identical. They have orange hair. Kushina inquired. When the umbu nodded, she snorted. Ah, my brothers. They're being nice. Good. Hey, Mikoto, want to go sit down? Your brothers? Mikoto asked faintly as she settled herself behind the vixen's shoulders. Ichitora and Enitora, identical twins, and total dorks, Kushina replied and headed back to the high concrete wall that would lead up into the stands. Before they were born, the story goes, they moved so much in my mother's womb that she compared them to brawling tigers, hence their names. When they sync up, it's like they're one person in 2 bodies. They can even talk in unison. Kushina rambled on about her brothers, but Mikoto stopped listening. She was thoroughly tired of feeling like she was trapped on a roller coaster. Her injuries throbbed and she dearly wanted to lie down and sleep, but she couldn't. I need to see my baby so that I know he's alright. Naruto rubbed his arms furiously as he slunk around at the tail end of the group. After the cold wind had passed, everyone else had relaxed as they got underway back to the stadium. But Naruto just felt worse and worse as the minutes dragged on. Not even leaving the forest for the village streets eased the rising sensation of dread that crawled up and down his spine. It's like I'm back in the forest of death and I'm heading towards the Cuba bones. But, that's so far away from here. I stopped feeling it once I reached the tower. I shouldn't feel it all the way over here. And yet the eerie feeling remained. It was like the insane red eye of the giant fox was staring at him. It was like its sickly energy could reach out and grab him and make him its helpless puppet again. He wanted to run far away until he stopped feeling its evil presence. It can't get me, he chanted to himself. It's dead, it can't get me. It's dead and buried. I'm okay, it can't get me again. Kushina sprawled across several empty seats as she rested and gathered her strength. All the minor injuries that she'd acquired earlier had healed, but she was still a bit sore in places. With concerns that there were more enemy kitsune somewhere inside or outside of Konoha, waiting for one last strike, she had to be ready for anything. In the row below her, Mikoto fidgeted with her bandaged arm while she sat with her injured ankle propped up on the back of the chair in front of her. Her Uchiha friend was beat up and exhausted, but Kushina knew she wouldn't relax. Mikoto wouldn't rest until Sasuke was back within her reach, safe and healthy. It would certainly ease Kushina's mind when Naruto was back, too. Tora will take care of Naruto. They never were mean to him. Arashi was the only brother that really disliked Naruto at all. So he'll be fine, Sasuke, too. And there are umbu shadowing them to boot, so everything will be just fine. She sighed and rested her chin on her forepaws. I suppose that Minato's still busy flashing all over killing demons. It's too bad. I was hoping that he could come here and rest with me, maybe cuddle a little. Today really sucks. Her 5 tails twitched and wriggled as she sank into a daydream of an uninterrupted final trial where Naruto went on to participate in the second round and performed well enough to be declared a Chunin. Then she would have taken him out to his favorite restaurant and fed him all the ramen that he wanted. And then she and Naruto would have gone back to the house where Minato would be waiting and he'd be so proud. If only things could have gone that way, Kushina sulked. Even if he didn't make Chunin, it would still be okay so long as he didn't get hurt in the second round. It would be so much better than this mess. Before she could really get into her seething over how disastrous the day had gone, a slight commotion one level up caught her ear. She lifted her head and peered up the chair-covered slope to see the clump of medics and patients that she'd first visited to get Mikoto properly patched up. It looked like Jiraiya was up there along with some blonde woman in a green loose jacket. That can't be Tsunade, can it? Intrigued, Kushina bounded up the rows of seats until she reached the group of ninja and found that Senju Tsunade was indeed back in Konoha. "What are you doing here?" she blurted out in shock. The busty blonde woman whirled around and narrowed her light brown eyes at the five-tailed vixen. "Who are you?" "Tsunade Hime surprised me too." Jiraiya boomed with a grin and looped an arm over the woman's shoulders. "What great timing, eh?" "Jiraiya." Tsunade growled warningly. "You know this kitsune?" Her eyes flitted over the red fox. "You didn't seduce this horny old goat, did you?" "You, no." Kushina gagged. "No way. I have a boyfriend." "Yes, I know you have a boyfriend." Jiraiya flashed Kushina a look that was almost disapproving. "Not a new one," Kushina informed the white-haired man with a sniff. "Just the one that I've always had." Jiraiya gaped at her as he tried to get his mind around what she was saying. "So, Jiraiya, who is she?" Tsunade demanded and roughly shrugged his arm off her shoulders. "How do you know her if you didn't sleep with her?" "She is Uzumaki Kushina," Kaito said, wandering over from a little kitsune conference several sections to the left. "Hello, Tsunade-chan. It's nice to see you again." "Kaito-san," Tsunade blinked, startled. "Aren't you retired?" "Yes, and very old, too," he smiled. "But age isn't as much of a problem for me as it would be for you." "What do you have a tail?" the blonde woman blinked. "Very observant of you," he said with a wry smile and twitched the fluffy appendage. "I have 6 of them, actually." Tsunade goggled at him before whipping her head back to the red vixen. "Kushina. That's my name, Datebanet." Kushina grinned. "Great," Tsunade grunted and rubbed furiously at her forehead. "I come here chasing a crazy old woman and I find a mess that keeps getting bigger and more tangled." "A crazy old woman?" Kushina repeated, cocking her head curiously. "Yes," the Senju growled. "A crazy old woman that refers to me as her descendant and seems to know an awful lot about me, enough to dump guilt trips on me, and knows at least one of my family's jutsu." Kushina cocked her head the other way. "Weird. Which one?" Kaito inquired. "This one," Tsunade replied, tapping the purple-hued diamond-shaped chakra seal on her forehead. Kaito fingered his ruined ear and narrowed his eyes in deep thought. "What did she look like?" "An old servant woman with gray hair up in 2 buns, Tsunade answered. "Why?" Kushina narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "That sounds like the gardener." "Tell me, are you a direct descendant of Senju Hashirama?" Kaito asked. "Yes," Tsunade snapped. "What the hell does that have to do with anything?" "And she said that she'd be here?" Kaito questioned with a deep frown. "Why else would I come back to this miserable village?" Tsunade hissed, her patience clearly fraying. "The old crone taunted me, swore that if I wanted answers from her I'd have to come here and see her." "Huh, then where the hell is she?" Kaito complained, tugging fiercely on the stump of his ear. "If Mito-sama was here, clearing up this invasion would have been a cakewalk. And she'd probably have some idea what the wind earlier was about." "Mito? The nice old gardener of the Uzumaki clan." Jiraiya blinked. "She asked a lot of questions about you, Tsunade Hime. I'm surprised that she managed to track you down so quickly. You told some strange old hag about me?" Tsunade roared, her face darkening with anger. "Now is not the time to be fighting, children," Kaito interrupted firmly. "If Mito-sama isn't here, she's where the real danger is lurking." "The gardener?" Kushina said, baffled. "She wasn't always a gardener," Kaito told her. 250 or so years ago, she was someone much different." Minato crouched on the roof of a restaurant and gulped water between dog-like pants. He was really getting tired and overheated, and he dearly hoped that there would be no more calls for assistance. All he wanted was to rest and catch his breath for a while. But he didn't count on things being over yet. The all-clear signal hadn't gone over the Umbu radio. And that odd gust of icy wind that had buffeted him earlier. That wind wasn't normal. His claws tapped thoughtfully against the gray roof tiles. It wasn't a futon jutsu, but I might as well check it out while I have the time. Since he couldn't speak, he tapped a coded message into his radio to declare his actions, turned his nose towards the direction that the wind had come from, and set off at an easy lope. He had always expected that he would need to possess another of his kind or purify a Hanyu to escape the grave. He had known that in doing that it would take time to devour the soul of his victim, alter the new body to his liking, and rebuild his strengths before he could properly take revenge for old and new wrongs. But now he had 9 lives to rebuild his old body so that he could take his vengeance now. The fresh life force animated his blackened skeleton and sparked the regrowth of organs, muscle, skin, and fur. 5 of his tails were free of the earth and the tangle of tree roots that had bound them, and it was only a matter of time before the remaining 4 broke loose. His upper torso was out of the grave and looming over the tree tops. Newly reborn lungs sucked in shuddering shallow breaths. Lidless eyes rolled in their sockets as they slowly focused and saw for the first time. Long strips of white cartilage that were developing into ears slowly unfurled and took in the sounds of groaning trees and terrified wildlife. A tongue lolled out of the side of a lipless mouth and tasted dirt and the ashy remains of moss and vines that still clung to the mostly naked skull. Soon, I shall taste blood. Kyubi no Yoko. A small distant voice called up to him. Rise and hear my commands. He tilted his head down and struggled to get his regenerated eyes to focus on a cluster of tiny lesser beings that huddled near his forepaws. He tried to smell for them, but his nose hadn't formed enough to detect anything. He lowered his skull and finally saw enough to determine that they were more of his kind. When your body is complete, you will go to Konoha and destroy that wretched village. The leader of the little group commanded. Yes, I will. His thoughts screeched to a halt. Who is this inferior fox that presumes to order me around? Fresh indignant rage blossomed in his uncovered ribcage. For centuries he'd been dead and buried within sight of his most important target, left infuriatingly impotent. Now, after so very, very long, Kitsune had come for him, not to serve him but to use him. These worms should worship him and far his power. And yet they arrogantly thought to make him their servant. They would pay. Hooray! He raised one mostly skeletal paw and slammed it down on the wretched insects. The survivors sought to flee, but he struck again and even scooped a few up in his jaws. Crushing them in his teeth, he drank in their life energies like sweet nectar and boosted his rebirth further. Arrogant whelps. He seethed and the corona of his yuki boiled ferociously. They didn't even know my name. A 6th tail emerged into the sunlight and he lifted his head to survey his surroundings with increasingly clear vision. Trees. That stupid human's trees. I hate trees. With a hiss he wasted power on vomiting flames on the greenery until he was ringed with smoke and fire. The flames started out blue and turned the usual shades once they caught hold of their fuel. They weren't black, like that other stupid human's ice-spawned fire. The petty act of destruction almost made him feel better. Fresh muscle formed over his ribcage and down his forelegs as fur sprouted along his spine and over his chest. Konoha. Yes, I will destroy it. I will leave it a smoking ruin. A crater. A wasteland. A 7th tail slowly slithered free, uprooting dozens of giant trees in the process. That stupid human is long dead by now. That other stupid human is also long dead. And that bitch, the wretched vixen bitch, she must be dead. Those horrid humans must have found her out and killed her. So there will be no one to stop me this time. He clacked his toothy jaws in hungry anticipation. The leaf will burn. The Uchiha will burn. The human race will burn. They will pay for what was done to me. I will make them all but a fleeting memory in my new world. And white chains that looked like mere threads against his vast bulk coiled around his neck and forelimbs, over his back and flanks, and bound his thrashing tails. A sense of weight and weakness flowed over him and his healing slowed. It was a horribly familiar sensation, and when he traced the chains back to the source he saw a horribly familiar figure. Damn you, Uzumaki. Chapter 59, Killing the Dead. Kurohi Yuma sighed wearily and set aside the ledgers that he'd been reviewing and moved to look out the window of his office. He stared out over the chaotic tangle of buildings that filled the Kurohi district and grimaced. In his earliest memories, there had been clear pathways and plenty of spaces for flower gardens. But most of that was gone, built over so that there was more housing for the new foxes that were born. The only streets unaffected by the almost cancerous growth of buildings were the roads that acted as boundary lines between the districts. The Uzumaki and their lackeys call us mad for striking out at the humans, he mused. But even if there wasn't any need for vengeance, we would still have to do this. There simply isn't enough room behind these walls anymore. He opened his windows to get some fresh air and leaned out, turning his face in the general direction of Konoha, where his father and son were enacting their plans. I hope that things are going well. Mito clenched her teeth and tightened her anchoring chains around the tree that she was perched in as her foe struggled against her hold. I had forgotten just how strong he was. Uzumaki! His terrible booming voice bellowed. Release me, you traitorous bitch! You call me a traitor? She snorted derisively. That would imply that I was on your side once, and I never was. You can't hold me forever. He howled as her chains bit into his naked muscle and blackened bone. You didn't last more than 5 minutes last time, and the only thing that saved you was those humans. And they are dead now. No one can save you when I break free. That is true, she said quietly, more to herself than him. Madara and Hashirama-kun are long dead. They cannot come to my aid this time. But it has been 250 years since the last time. You have been dead, your power mostly sealed or used to bind your wretched soul to the land of the living. I, however, have lived those years. The greenish crystal pendant around her neck shattered. Her pupils stretched into slits, her nails grew into claws, her ears lengthened into furry points, the deep wrinkles smoothed from her face and hands, and a coppery red-gold tint returned to her hair. The air around her shimmered with power like a heat-spawned mirage, which made it difficult to count just how many tails were waving behind her. And I have grown stronger. So, she was a kunoichi? Kushina guessed. Well, yes, Kaito nodded. Mito-sama was. Quit struggling, prisoner. Kushina looked over at one of the entryways that led out from the interior hallways of the stadium to see her brother Arashi gleefully dragging along another kitsune. It was a tan-colored male that had his legs hobbled and his 3 tails cut down to stumps. Arashi hauled the miserable beast along by a wire-threaded rope tied tightly around his neck. Who do you have there? Kaito asked before Kushina could. This bastard is Isamu, Arashi said with a smirk. He's one of Udai's weasel-why little friends. I figure we can get Konoha to torture him a bit so that he spills where Udai is and what his plans are. Udai's already dead, Kushina sniffed. Ah, damn it. Arashi growled. Then I wasted my time catching him. I should have just killed him instead. Isamu whined piteously and cringed away from Arashi as much as the rope would let him. If he knows of the Kurohi's plans, he could still be useful. Kaito turned to the two Sunin. If you could find a skilled Yamanaka for me so that we can quickly pick his brains. Pick my brains. Isamu squeaked. Will they cut open my head? No, they'll just read your mind, Kushina informed him. Every secret, every thought, no matter how hard you try to hide it, a Yamanaka can find it. I don't want a human in my head. Isamu wailed. I didn't even want to come here. Now my tails are gone and... Shut up. Arashi grunted and kicked the fox in the ribs. If you don't want a Yamanaka prying in your thoughts, why don't you just tell us what your friends are up to? Jiraiya suggested. I'll tell you anything. Isamu promised. He tried to sink to his belly, but his hobbled legs made it impossible, so he flopped onto his side. Anything you want to know. What are your side's plans? Tsunade demanded, grabbing Isamu by the scruff of his neck. Aie! He shrieked, eyes bulging out of their sockets in terror. Don't touch me, human. I don't want to be skinned. What a wimp, Kushina sneered. He always was a wuss, Arashi agreed, giving the captive kitsune another kick. I think he always followed Udai around so that others wouldn't bully him. If you want me to let you go, answer the dim question. Tsunade snapped, giving him a rough shake. What are your other plans for attacking the village? Why Yuta-sama, he went into the forest. Isamu babbled. He went into the forest to wake it up. That's where the rest are, in the forest. What forest? Kaito demanded sharply, shoving Tsunade aside to grab Isamu's ears and pull hard. Wake what up? The forest of death. Isamu gasped, trying to curl in on himself. They went to the grave. Kaito paled and drew back from the wretched fox. What is he talking? Abu Kushina stiffened and stared as her fur bristled. He can't mean that, can he? They can't be that insane, right? I take it that this is a bad thing. Arashi frowned. Did you sleep through all your history lessons? Kushina hissed. The forest of death is where the Kyuubi no Yoko's bones are buried. But it's dead, Arashi shrugged. What's so frightening about a bunch of bones? True, it is dead, Kaito nodded. But many fear that it isn't gone. And if they know a way to resurrect it? It isn't gone, Kushina gulped. It's still there. It touched Naruto. Kaito bowed his head. Then we are in serious trouble. Mito grimaced as she struggled to drag the Kyuubi no Yoko back down into its grave. Kitsune, which had been left to guard against interruption of the ritual, were now attacking her. Either they had no idea that the Kyuubi was uncontrolled and their leaders killed, or they thought that they could somehow salvage the situation and still use the Med Demon for their bloodthirsty ends. Under normal circumstances their interference wouldn't have been much of a problem, but with all of her focus and energy on the Kyuubi, she really couldn't do much to defend herself. I might have to let the beast go, she cursed to herself as she flicked another attacker away with one of her tails. I can't subdue it and deal with them at the same time. But if I let it go, it will be able to attack me and continue to regenerate. By her estimation, the Kyuubi was about 70% regenerated. The burning trees were clear proof that it was already able to launch attacks. So if she let it go, it wouldn't take the beast very long to fully heal, and it would surely attempt to kill her while she dealt with these pests. I need help. I thought I could bury it again, disrupt its rebirth, and seal its power away again. But I'm still not strong enough to defeat it alone. The gap between their strengths was much smaller than it had been previously. The last time she'd gone up against the monstrous fox, it had taken all of her energy to stall it for 5 minutes, and the effort had almost killed her. Now the effort wasn't nearly as much of a strain, but the med creature fought with the added strength of insanity and desperation. Some of the enemy Kitsune started launching attacks against her chains, causing them to slip, and one even snapped. The Kyuubi howled and renewed its thrashing against her imprisonment. Mito cursed under her breath and fired a fresh wave of chains from her chest to try and repair the damage to her original binding. I should have sent a message to them, saying where I was going, she chastised herself. I should be too old to make such foolish mistakes. If another sentry fox tried to attack her directly and got within a yard before she noticed. A flash of yellow fur, black cloth, and white armor slammed into the attacking Kitsune's flank, driving it savagely sideways and through a dense screen of leaves. What the? Mito blinked and sniffed at the air. Who was that smelled like a wolf? A memory of a shaggy black wolf monster wearing red old-style armor racing towards her with madness blazing in his red spinning eyes flitted through her mind. A werewolf? Minato was sure what he expected to find when he went in search of what might have caused the odd cold wind, but it certainly wasn't an undead fox demon the size of Gamabunta. The creature was a hideous sight, mostly skinless with lidless bulging eyes and a ghastly lipless grin, its body partly shrouded by smoke and flame. But as he stared at it in horror, he noticed that it was restrained by odd glowing threads. Shaking off his shock, he moved in closer. The odd glowing threads, he discovered, were actually chains fashioned from chakra, just like what Kushina could produce. And the source of the chains was a figure enveloped in a haze of power. Since it was using a technique that Kushina had described as a Kekai Genkai, he guessed that the person was a relative of hers, and a very powerful one at that. I can't count how many tails. Are there 7? 8? 9? But whoever it was in trouble. Dozens of Kitsune were attacking the figure, or the chains it was making. Their attacks were light and swift, but their darting movements made it impossible for the chain maker to retaliate. Not that whoever it is can retaliate, he thought. Whenever Kushina used that technique she couldn't do much else. Sometimes when she was subduing a foe she couldn't even move to dodge attacks from other enemies. Flexing his claws, he threw himself into the fray. The mysterious person was clearly a relative of Kushina's, therefore mostly likely on Konoha's side. The giant fox zombie was just as clearly an enemy of the village. So the decision on what to do was easy. Every time a kitsune revealed itself by attacking, he went after it. He broke limbs, he smashed jaws, he shattered skulls, and he snapped spines. As he thinned down their numbers he took the time to use more than brute force, slamming Rasengan orbs into chests and shredding foes with invisible claws of wind. The few kitsune remained after that shifted their attention from the one that was restraining their giant monster, to him. They had developed a healthy respect for him now and tried to cloak themselves in illusions or lure him into traps. But they didn't seem to get his hydration and how it allowed him to escape their snares and bombs and illusion-cloaked blades, and when he retaliated against them they never saw him coming. He dispatched Kitsune number 38, a charcoal grey vixen with 4 tails, with a Rasengan to the spine after breaking her right foreleg, and sniffed at the smoke-choked air for the next. "I will not be defeated." The giant zombie fox bellowed, which startled Minato as all he'd heard from the creature since his arrival on the scene was roars of rage. "Not again. Not by you. Die, Uzumaki." He had to scramble back to the mystery Uzumaki as his seek and destroy activities had drawn him away. The undead creature now had 8 enormous tails straining against the chakra chains and a 9th appeared to be emerging through the tall dense trees. Its half-skeletal jaws were opened wide and an ominous sphere of black energy was sluggishly forming. Minato positioned himself to intercept the attack when it was launched, drew one of the seal-wrapped trikine he had on hand, and waited. It took several minutes, but he had expected that. From personal experience with Kushina's chakra chains, he knew the technique interrupted and suppressed chakra flow in the ensnared target. Kushina had even claimed to him that it would subdue foes that were many times stronger than the caster. So it didn't surprise him that the giant kitsune was having so much trouble gathering energy, it surprised him that it could do it at all. "This thing is strong." Finally the beast fired the massive sphere. Minato calmly raised his weapon, held the seal on the handle facing the black orb, and gave the seal a little twist with his chakra. The seal twisted open, creating a black void that easily swallowed the deadly sphere, then he twisted the seal again, sealing up the void and locking the dangerous energy into a pocket of frozen space/time. "What?" Adjusting his grip on the kunai, Minato pulled back his arm and hurled the blade into the creature's gaping maw. The massive kitsune reared its head back, straining against the binding chains, its bulging eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. Then, with a moment's concentration and a pair of hand seals, he unzipped the seal again. Boom! The undead things puffed outward and gouts of smoke burst through bare gaps in its ribcage. Its throat exploded, leaving a ragged hole, and more black smoke boiled out of its jaws and nostrils. With a gurgling groan the skinless monstrosity leaned forward and half collapsed. "Very impressive," a woman's voice said. "This makes you the second werewolf that I have encountered that has retained its sentience. Hopefully you are a better fellow than the first one." He peered over his shoulder to find a woman of indeterminate age crouched on a tree branch with dozens of chakra chains sprouting from her torso. The haze of power had faded enough for him to get a better look at her and he tentatively pegged her as an 8-tailed fox. He blinked upon noticing the diamond-shaped chakra storage seal on her forehead that appeared to be identical to Tsunade's. "Who is this?" The mood was beyond grim as a small horde of ninja and kitsune sprinted towards the village's largest and more remote training ground. The Hokage was near the front, riding on Inma's shoulders to preserve his strength for the struggle ahead. He was surrounded by Umbu, kitsune, and dozens of Konohanin. Nearly all of the village's major clans were represented, with only the Uchiha, the Hyuga, and the Aburame not having high-ranking members present. "I wish that Mikoto could come," Kushina thought as she bounded through the trees on Furukawa Kaito's heels. "But this fight is no place for a lamed ninja. It's probably best that she just stays at the stadium and waits for Sasuke to arrive." But her company would have been nice. She also wished that Minato was present. Before their small army had departed from the stadium, the Hokage had tried to summon him but he had failed to appear. That had to mean that he was busy somewhere, or that he was too hurt to respond, or "He's fine," she scowled. "He's just busy somewhere. When he's free, he'll catch up with us. There's no way some demon, Otonin, or nutty Uchiha got to him. Not with his crazy high-ration skills." The group gathered atop a ridge that overlooked the forest of death to survey the situation, and it didn't look good. The Kyuubi no Yoko was almost completely free of its grave, with only its back legs apparently still buried. The body was partly masked by the thick smoke rising from burning trees, but what they could make out didn't look promising. Its 9 massive tails twisted over the treetops and its skeleton was mostly covered in flesh and a few patches of fur. Very soon it seemed that it would be completely restored and ready to rampage through Konoha. "They're mad," Kaito muttered. "To revive this beast, they're absolutely mad." "What are your orders, Hokage-sama?" one of the Umbu asked. "Long-ranged attacks only," the old man said. "And no katonjutsu. Encircle it but be wary of its tails. If we can damage it enough before it fully heals, its resurrection will fail. That thing is coated in yuki," a white vixen warned. "Even a near miss could result in terrible chakra burns." "I can't tell if Mito-sama is there, there's too much smoke," Kaito frowned. "If she isn't, Kushina will have to use the Kyuzeri no Tenko to try and restrain it." Kushina's hackles rose at the thought of getting any closer to that thing, but nodded in acceptance of her role. "I got it. Time is of the essence." The Hokage gestured towards the giant reanimated corpse. "The Kyuubi no Yoko must be destroyed immediately." Without any further discussion, the ninja began racing towards the zombie demon. They swarmed through the treetops and spread out to surround their enormous foe. As they drew nearer, the wind shifted and the curtain of smoke around the monster dispersed some, giving a much clearer view of the monstrosity, and the chakra chains that bound it. "Oh good, Bachan already has it bound," Kushina thought with relief. "But, there's no telling how long she's held it back. She might need my help." She hurried to move around towards the demon's head where she could get into a position to add her own chains without interfering with the ones already in place, barely noticing Jiraiya, Tsume, and Kuromaru shadowing her. "No." The Kyuubi bellowed and strained harder against the chains. "No, no, no. I won't." There was an explosion high overhead in a billow of white smoke, and then a gigantic toad wearing a jacket hurtled out of the sky. The brown, pipe-smoking amphibian crashed down onto the reanimated Kyuubi's back, and there was a terrific crack that had to be the creature's spine snapping. The Kyuubi made a horrid shrieking sound and sank almost completely from view while the summoned toad still perched on its corpse. "Great move, Jiraiya-sama," Tsume crowed as they came to a stop to watch the new development. "Hey, that wasn't me," Jiraiya protested. "If not him, then?" Kushina grinned broadly. "So this is what Minato was busy with. And what a genius move, dropping a massive weight on the Kyuubi while it's bound and its body is still incomplete and fragile." "Ugh, what a disgusting beast," Gamabunta rumbled. "Stupid, fat, frog." The Kyuubi snarled and wheezed. "I am not a frog." Gamabunta boomed and drew his massive tanto from its sheath. "I am a toad." And then the toad stabbed the tip of his weapon down into the zombie's neck, decapitating it. The chain-covered, half-raised 9 tails jerked and then collapsed into the forest, toppling more trees as they landed. Gamabunta twisted his knife and then removed it and sheathed it once more. "I do believe this scum is finished," Gamabunta said and puffed on his pipe. "I shall depart." With another burst of white smoke, the giant toad demon vanished back to his distant mountain home. "Well, if you didn't summon that toad, who did?" Tsume demanded. "Let's go look and see," Kushina suggested cheerfully and took off again towards where the old gardener should be. "I hope Minato is there, too. I can't wait to see Jiraiya's face." As soon as Gamabunta cut the Kyuubi's head from its body, the thing started to rot. Combined with the heavy acrid smoke, the stench was intense and overwhelming. Minato wasn't sure whether he wanted to fall out of the tree or vomit. Why did the wind have to change? He moaned and tried to sneeze the stink out of his nostrils. "This has got to be the nastiest thing I've ever smelled." As he watched through watering eyes, the flesh and organs putrefied and fell right off the blackened bones. The thing seemed to be rotting even faster than it had regenerated itself earlier. It was like a time-lapse film of plants sprouting, only it was incredibly disgusting. The Uzumaki woman seemed unmoved by the wretched smell or sight. She just crouched there and kept her chains coiled around the rotting carcass. Only when all the flesh was gone from the skeleton, leaving just a sullen glow of red yuki clinging to the bones, did she move. She leapt up into the air as her chains faded away and fired 3 dense orbs of energy white where the cubeas had been black. The energy balls struck the cubea's skull and exploded with terrific booms and flashes of light. When Minato's senses recovered from that assault, he saw her darting over the corpse, slapping seal papers over the bones as she went. The giant demon's skull had been shattered, with only a few teeth still recognizable among the shards of shattered bone. I wonder why she did that, he pondered as the wind shifted again, mercifully blowing the stench in a different direction. Was it to make it much harder to revive it again? Or to banish the thing's spirit to the afterlife? Or maybe a werewolf? Minato's ear twitched and he turned to spy glimpses of several umbu hiding nearby. The horrid stink of the giant kitsune had completely masked their arrival. And now that he could smell again, he could tell that more humans and kitsune, hopefully allies, were coming. Perhaps I ought to leave and find out what that summoning I ignored was all about. That was brilliant. Kushina cried as she bounded into view. You totally bleh. She coughed and came to a stop after catching a lingering whiff of the corpse. What's that stink, Datebane? He pointed a claw in the direction of the huge fox skeleton. Ew, it smells so bad I can taste it. She complained, pawing at her nose as she sat by his feet. Does it reek so bad because this is the second time it's died? The werewolf shrugged. Minato. He looked up to see his old sensei one tree over, staring at him. Is that you? Minato gave a little wave. Jiraiya looked like he was going to cry. In the treetops all around him more and more Konohanin with a sprinkling of kitsune began to gather. He saw Tsume and Kuromaru, along with Inoichi, Chauza, and Shikaku. Kakashi turned up as well, with other shinobi that had been part of his age group that were now all grown up. Soon even the Hokage would be here. They all stared at him with confusion or wonder, but none moved to attack him and a lump started to form in his throat. I've been back in Konoha for months now, but it almost felt like he had just come home. A twinge of warning raced up his spine and he looped his arms around Kushina's fox body and leapt. A kunai with an exploding tag landed where he had been crouching, destroying the branch and blowing splinters in every direction. A werewolf in umbu armor. It seems that the Hokage is more like his dishonored student than anyone ever imagined. Minato dug his claws deeply into his new branch and snarled at a new mass of shinobi that had appeared, and its leader especially. Fugaku. Chapter 60, Truth. As his power was sealed away, the mighty demon seethed. He'd almost been free, almost achieved a measure of vengeance, only to have his hopes dashed. But while he had been beaten back again, he was not defeated, not gone. I will never leave. He swore as he went about anchoring his spirit to his remains once more to fight the constant pull of death. I will wait forever for my revenge. Even beyond the ending of the world I will wait. Dreams of sweet destruction rose up like a refuge against the stark nothingness of his fresh prison. I will not leave this plane until all the Uchiha and the rest of their wretched species are eliminated. Only then, when I have destroyed all that you love and treasure, will I go to the afterlife. And then I will find you, Father, and I will devour your soul. Naruto stumbled, and then the pressure was gone. The feeling that he was being watched, that something was out to get him, had vanished. He felt lighter and almost relaxed. The blonde genin even started to smile again. This has got to be a good sign, right? The stadium's main entrance came into view and Naruto was soon bouncing off ahead of his uncles, Sasuke, Shikamaru, and Shino. Everything's over and we're home free. Every inch of Minato's fur that wasn't pressed down by clothing bristled to stand on end as he surveyed the group of Uchiha that had appeared. By his estimate, at least half of the active ninja of that clan were present and ready for a fight. If he had to battle with them, it would be difficult. Those with activated Sharingan would be able to predict the paths of his special kunai and deflect or dodge them before they could get close enough for him to use them as attack points. The only way he could tangle with the Sharinon was to use dozens of kunai to lay down warp points all over the battlefield and make it impossible for them to guess where he would appear next. But he didn't even have enough kunai handy to make a basic assault with his high ration, let alone seed the battleground with enough markers to make that strategy work. He could briefly leave the forest to fetch a store of fresh trichinae from a storage depot, and drop off Kushina in a safe area while he was at it. But she would be the only kitsune he would likely have time to save before he would have to deal with angry Uchiha. And it would make them even more eager to kill him, as a werewolf that could use jutsu and defended dangerous demons was something like the ultimate evil in their eyes. Well, isn't this just wonderful? Fugaku, the Hokage's aged voice called out. I do believe that you were encouraged to remain within the walls of your district until after the trials were completed. Considering recent events, it is quite clear to me that the trials are over, Fugaku scowled. Now wait a moment while your pet werewolf and kitsune minions are dealt with so that we are free to discuss these recent events at our leisure. Fugaku raised a hand and several Uchiha leapt forward in a wide semicircle around the yellow werewolf, silver blades raised. Minato tensed and slipped his arm around Kushina's torso again, making her squeak. Stand down. The Hokage bellowed. Umbunin drew their short swords, ready to intervene if ordered. Kitsune lashed their tails, if they had them out, and snarled. Thwack. Everything seemed to freeze. Minato's jaw dropped when he spied the old woman standing beside Fugaku. She'd shed all her kitsune features and looked like a perfectly ordinary, perfectly human old woman with slightly stooped shoulders, wrinkles, and silvery hair. In one hand she held a folding fan that was as faded and frayed as the rest of her clothing, and she had hit Fugaku upside the head with it. How dare you? The Uchiha snarled, one remaining eye blazing to red, spinning life. No, young man, she snorted, gazing calmly over his shoulder to avoid his dangerous gaze. How dare you? You are leader of your clan, but you are subordinate to the Hokage. Didn't your father teach you anything? Several Uchiha sucked in sharp breaths as Fugaku's mouth twisted in fury. Now why don't you run along home with all of your clansmen? The old woman suggested. You aren't needed here, and I'm sure that there's plenty of cleanup hunting to be doing back in the village. Minato's jaw dropped lower. She's definitely related to Kushina. We most certainly will not return to the village. Fugaku ground out. There are kitsune present demons that rank at least A class that must be destroyed. And worse, we have uncovered evidence that the Hokage is experimenting with werewolves. This prototype must be killed and the situation dealt with immediately. I am no prototype. Minato snarled softly, flexing his claws into the bark under his paws. It didn't matter that most present wouldn't understand his words. At least Same and Kuromaru would hear him. I didn't volunteer for this, I didn't seek it out. I have done no such thing, the Hokage responded coolly. If you wish to lose the military police, please, continue to make baseless accusations and disobey my commands. The Uchiha clan has no confidence in your leadership any longer. Thwack. The old woman flashed Fugaku a disapproving glare as he wobbled from the second unexpected blow to his jaw. What gives you the idea that you have the right to behave so shamefully? She snapped, gray eyes hard. You remind me of the worst product of your clan. Your arrogance and sense self-importance, it brings to mind Madara. You insult me? Fugaku shouted as his face darkened towards an alarming shade of red. Odd, she sniffed. With your attitude I thought you'd be flattered by the comparison. The Uchiha clan hissed in fury like it was a single organism and shifted to loosely encircle her. The old woman seemed utterly oblivious to her rapidly deteriorating situation. She just balanced on Fugaku's branch just within arm's reach of him and lazily fanned herself as she stared at some point low on his face. Should I try to rescue her? Minato pondered as he watched. Sure, she stood up the Kyuubi without any trouble, but that was one undead demon. These are dozens of angry Uchiha. This is great. Minato twitched his ear at the voice and spied a grinning kitsune several yards to his right. Mito-sama's going to incinerate these bastards. Senile old woman. Fugaku barked. There is no greater insult than to compare an Uchiha to Madara. He disgraced himself beyond all measure and has left a lingering stain upon our proud name. We labor every day to undo the damage that his dishonorable actions have wrought. So, your bad behavior perpetrated in the name of dealing with the consequences of Madara's bad behavior is somehow justified? Is that what you're saying? She snapped her fan closed and waggled it disapprovingly. That makes no sense at all. Unable to restrain his temper any longer, Fugaku raised his fist to strike her. But she easily danced away from his punch with a speed and grace that belied her apparent age, and she even smacked his wrist before she moved out of his range. Eager to avenge their leader's humiliation, a young Uchiha leapt at her back and stabbed her. Only to find his kunai stuck through a broken tree branch. I suppose that none of you were taught to respect your elders, either, Mito sighed dryly, revealing herself to have moved a few branches above and to the left of where Minato and Kushina sat. What a shame. Who are you? Fugaku demanded. What gives you the right to interfere? My name is Uzumaki Mito, she replied. And I was a ninja of Konoha once. What? Kushina muttered and tilted her head. Really? Minato pricked his ears forward with interest. She was a Konohanin, not an Uzashionin? When was this? I've never heard of you, Fugaku sneered dismissively. I'm not surprised, Mito shrugged. I was long retired before you were even born. Perhaps you ought to get back to your knitting, old woman, an Uchiha girl scoffed. I don't knit, dear, Mito replied. No, a male voice snarled, you meddle. A patch of leaves rustled and an elderly man pulled himself into view. His robes were torn and his whole body was covered in blood, dirt, and ash. When Minato caught a whiff of his scent, underneath the blood, the mud, and the ash, the old man smelled like a fox. Kurohi Yuta, Mito sighed wearily and shook her head. I had hoped that the Kyuubi no Yoko had eaten you, it would have been the perfect karmic retribution for your insane folly. But alas. Bastard. Kushina growled lowly. So, Minato narrowed his eyes, he is an enemy. Shut up. Yuta snapped, cradling his left arm to his chest. It almost worked. It would have been perfect to destroy Konoha with its ancient half-forgotten enemy. To use the Uchiha's creation against the village that harbors them HRRK. Glowing white chains snapped around the filthy kitsune and one loop tightened quite snugly around his throat, cutting off whatever else he desired to rant about. Hush up, you. Mito scowled. Quit shouting out unsubstantiated rumors just to piss people off. What are you babbling about? Fugaku glowered at Yuta. Explain yourself immediately. The Kyuubi no Yoko was once a Hanyu that burned away all his human blood, Yuta choked, forcing his words past the chain on his throat. An ugly, strained smile bloomed on his filthy face. His mother was a demon but his father, it is said, was an Uchiha. There was a beat of silence followed by a jumble of very angry shouts from the Uchiha present. The rest of the ninja Minato included gaped in shock. None of the kitsune seemed particularly surprised and a few even snickered at the Uchiha's outrage. That's absurd. Fugaku hissed, after clapping his hands for silence. You slander us. Seeing that Fugaku, all the Uchiha, and, well, everyone, was distracted, Minato cautiously began to reverse his transformation and return to his human form. If he could manage it unnoticed, he could put his mask back on and hopefully be mistaken for a battle-worn Umbu. And even if he couldn't pull that off, at least a human he'd be able to speak and be understood. Maybe, Yuta coughed, still grinning. It is just a rumor. There's no one left who can confirm it, or solidly deny it. Unless, of course, you want to go down to the bones and ask the Kyuubi itself. That won't be necessary, Fugaku sneered. What you claim is quite impossible. No Uchiha would ever defile himself by breeding with a demon. And even if he had been deceived somehow into such a foul liaison, he would have killed the woman and any resulting spawn. That's almost what happened. Yuta tried to chuckle but coughed more. When the Uchiha discovered that his mistress was a kitsune, he killed her. The son, however, survived and his hatred was born. He sought power by any means necessary and purged himself of the human blood that came from his hated father. His hatred spread from the Uchiha to all of humankind, but the clan of his father still held a special place in his heart. I've had just about enough of your lies. Fugaku looked about ready to explode and his remaining Sharingan was almost popping out of his head. The Kyuubi no Yoko hated humans because it was a demon and hungered to cause us suffering. If it hated the Uchiha in particular for any reason, it was because it feared our power. What fools you are! Yuta snorted. The Kyuubi no Yoko wanted to make a grand gesture before its demise, and what grander than leveling a hidden village? So, instead of running to Takigaku or no Sato, which was closer to the battle site, he runs twice as far to Konoha, to kill as many Uchiha as he could with his death throes. It makes perfect sense. It also could have chosen Konoha because it housed both the Uchiha and the Senju clans, which had produced the two primary ninja that had thwarted his plans, decimated his small army, and mortally wounded him, Mito pointed out testily. That also makes perfect sense. Minato pulled his wolf mask back on over his face, carefully tightened the straps on his armor, and hoped that no one noticed that he wasn't wearing any shoes. Mito, Mito, Mito. His ugly smile turned patronizing. You remember the old proverb, the only thing more destructive than a lie is the truth. And we all know that the best rumors always contain a bit of truth. Therefore GNK. The chakra chains that bound him visibly tightened and Yuta started to turn purple. You talk too much, Mito growled. There is no proof one way or the other. Let that rumor lie buried in the past. STPIDBTCH. Yuta gurgled. Damn you and YRSTPID human huss. A kunai slipped between chain links and buried itself deep into Yuta's throat. The fox in human skin wheezed and blood oozed between his lips. Then he toppled out of the treetops to dangle by Mito's chains as his life started to ebb away. There are limits to how far my clan can be insulted, Fugaku scowled as he lowered his hand from the throwing position. I've heard more than enough filthy lies from you. His remaining eye shifted to stare at Mito. Cease your interference, or share his fate. We have demons and a werewolf to hunt down. What werewolf? Kushina piped up innocently. I don't see any werewolf here. That Fugaku snapped his head in their direction and stared, an expression of naked rage slowly congealing on his face. You. It was you who took my eye. Damn, he got a good enough look at my mask to remember it, Minato sighed. Without another word, Fugaku charged, intent on claiming vengeance for his crippling. Minato tried to catch a hold of Kushina and vanish from the scene, but she edged out of his reach. Before he could snap at her, she launched chains of her own from her back, striking Fugaku while he was mid-leap and unable to dodge, and leaving the clan leader dangling up against a tree trunk, helpless and even more furious. A few Uchiha clansmen moved to rescue him, but Umbunin blocked them. Thanks, he muttered to her and hopped down a few branches to face the bound Fugaku. Release me at once. Minato cut off Fugaku's demand by clapping his right hand to the back of the Uchiha's neck and squeezing. Right now, he said softly so that only Fugaku could hear. I'm really regretting taking only one of your eyes. Namikaze. Fugaku hissed. You can't be, how are you, this is impossible. Up above, the ninjas who had heard Fugaku's exclamations started to whisper to each other frantically, and Minato wondered why he'd even bothered putting the mask back on. Believe it, Minato said and tagged the Uchiha on the back of the neck with one of his Hiraishin seals. Now, go home. If I have to come after you again, I will be taking more than your last Sharingan. Fugaku continued to sputter, but as nothing coherent was coming out of his mouth, Minato left him there to hang to return to Kushina's side. Uzumaki Mito was already there. The old woman's, fox's, grey eyes were penetrating. You are very interesting, Mito said. We must have tea together while I am here. When my duty allows, he agreed warily. I will hold you to that, the old woman nodded and snapped open her fan. Minato felt his eyebrow lift when he noticed the black branch-like seal of the Senju clan decorating the fabric of the fan. Itachi, please escort your father home, the Hokage said, and Minato looked away from the old woman to see that Fugaku's older son was speaking with the ninja leader. I will, Itachi said with a deep bow. I apologize for my clan. The Hokage dismissed him with a stiff nod, and the Uchiha heir went about collecting his father from Kushina's grip. The rest of the nearby Uchiha looked very unhappy, but they no longer looked quite so ready to start a fight as they had earlier. Perhaps Itachi had calmed them down, or maybe what they had heard had disturbed them. Whatever the reason, I hope they're done being a thorn in the Hokage's side, and done plotting against Naruto. Hinata fidgeted anxiously as she and her friends waited with other genin outside the entrances of the civilian shelters. Their job was to protect the hidden caves against attackers so that the villagers would stay safe. But if there were no enemies in sight, they were to hide and wait. While she waited for new orders or some all-clear signal, Hinata worried. She worried about Shino and Kurenye-sensei. She worried about Shikamaru and Sasuke and Naruto. She worried about Neji and Hanabi and her father and all her relatives. She worried about everyone and everything. And sometimes the cycle of worry was broken by the memory of a conversation she'd had with Tenten shortly after they'd arrived here under Tsunade's orders. Why do you think you're going to be sealed? Why wouldn't I be? It's my fate be because I'm. You sound too much like Neji there. Anyway, maybe the reason that your dad hasn't given you a date for this sealing is because he won't put that thing on your forehead. But. She hadn't found a reason. Not one that Tenten had accepted. And still, after hours of thought, she still couldn't find an explanation that held water. Father sent me away, but won't seal me into the branch family? Why? Hiraka thought of himself as a pioneer. Everyone else except his sister, Manami, liked to call him a scout with delusions of grandeur. He cheerfully ignored them and went about his duties of checking out new territory for his pack to migrate to. They were werewolves and they kept safe and hidden by being rootless. Every year, sometimes every season, they would pack up and move to a new arena. Sometimes they would stop in a rural area and others they would camp out in some remote corner of the wilderness. They tried not to stay in the same place twice, but with many countries hosting demon hunting ninja it was impossible. Currently he was on a solo mission in the land of rice paddies. There were all sorts of rumors about some new group or splinter group or rogue group of shinobi that had recently settled in this country. If this turned out to be true, it would be crossed off the small list of safe territories that his pack could live in and their travel plans would have to be adjusted. And he needed to know where they were based to determine what borders they would have to be wary of when passing by the country. Considering the danger of a potential shinobi group nearby, Hiraka hiked along in human form dressed as an ordinary traveler. Even though he could travel more ground more comfortably as a wolf, he could really only risk that form in the wilderness and at night. It was slower and more irritating to wander around as a human, but other benefits were that he could use roads, pass through towns, and even stay in cheap inns when he had some money handy. I'm really getting sick of looking at rice paddies, he sighed and swatted at yet another mosquito. We should probably avoid this place anyway. There isn't much forest and there are too many farms. It will be impossible to enjoy the full moon here, even if there aren't any hunters here. He paused for a minute beside the border of a small forest before turning and entering the trees. This is where all the farmers say the ninja are camping out. Hopefully they won't see me if they're here. And if they do, hopefully they'll believe that I'm just a lost migrant worker. Hiraka's cautious search yielded no hidden shinobi, but he did find a pair of stone doors set into a hillside. It could have been a ninja base, a storage depot, or some forgotten ruin for all he knew, so he carefully investigated further. The doors were sealed in some way that made it impossible for him to pry them open, even with his full strength, but further searching revealed at least one smaller door that he could open. The buried complex he found behind the side door was dark and eerily quiet. It had been occupied recently according to his nose, but no one seemed to be home now. He hesitated for a long moment before slinking inside. Perhaps if this place was now abandoned, his pack could use it for their own purposes. They'd used half-ruined fortresses before. He almost started to relax when he stumbled over the first booby trap. A stone sank under his sandal and he barely backpedaled fast enough to avoid becoming a Pinsiyushian of poisoned needles. He didn't go any further down that particular hallway and he almost turned around and retraced his steps to the exit. But his worst flaw, his insatiable curiosity, flared up and he found himself exploring further. A few other corridors were protected by traps, but plenty of others were unprotected and free for him to explore. A lot of them seemed to lead to perfectly ordinary places like a mess hall and dormitories. However, some halls led into waking nightmares. The scout stumbled over rooms filled with strange machines, sharp implements, bottles of mysterious chemicals, and metal tables with leather straps. The air reeked of antiseptic and death and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And then he found a few prison cells. Some contained dead bodies. Others held bodies that were so warped it would be kinder if they were dead. And the rest imprisoned all kinds of demons and monsters. What sort of hellhole is this? Hiraka wondered, rubbing furiously at his arms to try and stop shaking. If this is the shinobi base, is this what those hunters really do? He knew he should leave, but his curiosity drove him to peer into the last cell in this corridor. Swallowing hard several times, Hiraka crept up to the last barred door and peeked through the tiny window. At first he thought it was empty, but then he noticed 3 small lumps of fur curled up in the far corner. Without really thinking about it, he sprouted a claw on his index finger and used it to pick the padlock on the door. Foxes. He blurted upon examining the fur balls. They were small, dirty, and felt thin under their fluff. The little creatures were lethargic and barely reacted to his touch, but all 3 were still quite alive. When he shifted them into the light cast through the doorway, he saw that their dingy pelts were bizarrely colored. The first was a pale blue like a robin's egg, the second was the vibrant green of a fresh sprout, and the third was a pink a few shades deeper than a cherry blossom. What the heck? Hiraka scratched at his shaggy black hair in puzzlement. Are they dyed? He poked at the docile critters for a few minutes more before mentally kicking himself. The owners of this hidden facility could come back at any time and he was playing with funny colored animals. He put them down and started to leave, but hesitated. Whatever happens, they'll probably die soon. And they're not monsters like everything else I've found in here. Should I take them with me? If he did, he'd have to hide them. Foxes that color would draw unwanted attention. And since they weren't in the best of health, he'd probably have to break his scouting trip off early. Oh, why not? They can be Manamai-chan's pets. I did promise to bring back a present for her. Hiraka scooped up the 3 little foxes and slipped out of the cell, almost jogging towards the exit in open air. I don't think I'll recommend that we travel here. It's muddy and crowded and full of mosquitoes. And then there's this horrible place that may or may not be abandoned. This is not the sort of place the alpha will want to go, not with his wife about to have a baby. I wonder, he muttered to himself as he hopped out of the side door and into the forest, what my sister will name these little critters. When Sasuke clawed his way out of the darkness, he woke up in what appeared to be a hospital room. Through the window he could see the fiery colors of sunset, which told him that he'd been out for several hours. He frowned and tried to remember why he'd been unconscious. His memory drew a blank. Unnerved, he slowly sat up and looked around. The room was small and quiet, and his mother sat dozing in a chair by his bed, opposite from the window. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair was mussed, there was a bandage on her cheek and her forearm, and her foot was in a cast while a pair of crutches leaned against the wall beside her. Mom, what happened to you? Now very alarmed, he reached over to wake her. His hand was gray with claw-like nails. The gray stopped just past his wrist, but there was another patch of it on his elbow. As he examined the rest of himself in a rising panic, he found more gray hard skin on his right foot, left knee, part of his face, and there was some sort of lump just below his right shoulder blade. And then, to his horror, as he studied his mutated hand, the gray started to spread down his arm. What's happening to me? Icy talons of terror grabbed hold of his throat and he gripped at his forearm in a futile attempt to keep the gray from spreading. But now his other hand was starting to change and there was an odd tightness and grinding sensation in his back. His scalp prickled and it felt like his tongue had brushed up against an elongated tooth. Calm down, Sasuke. He jumped and looked to the doorway to see Itachi with his Sharingan eyes red and spinning. Instead of looking away or fighting his older brother's gaze, he surrendered himself to his sibling's power. His frantic heartbeat slowed and his breathing came easier as calm was projected over him. Now, Itachi commanded, reverse these changes. Sasuke wanted to cry that he didn't know how, but the enforced calm stilled his voice. Then, slowly, the gray tinge receded from his skin. In less than 5 minutes, his body was completely normal once more and Itachi broke his stare. How are you feeling? His mother asked, now awake. She gently gripped his shoulders, her wounded arm moving stiffly. Does anything hurt? No, Sasuke croaked, trembling all over. What what happened? Itachi began recounting events to him, but Sasuke could barely follow it. It sounded like a tall tale that grew more and more unbelievable with each sentence his brother uttered. Yet somehow it had to be true. Itachi wouldn't make something like this up. It'll be alright, Sasuke, his mother promised as she hugged him once Itachi was finished. Sasuke couldn't imagine how, but he said nothing. His mother and brother left shortly after that, saying that they would return in the morning. Left alone, he leaned back into his pillow and stared blankly at the ceiling, trying to wrap his mind around what had supposedly happened after his match down in the arena. But it only made his head hurt, so he stopped thinking. He lifted his now perfectly human hand in front of his face and studied it. The appendage looked like it always had, but with a little focus and willpower, it turned monstrous again. Numb, he shifted it back and forth several times before fisting it in the sheets and squeezing his eyes closed. What have I become? Kushina yawned and stretched as she sauntered out of the bathroom. It was very late, and after a long, hard day of work it was time for bed. Now back in human form at last and dressed in a huge t-shirt and flannel pants, she crept into the bedroom. Minato was already passed out on the mattress. She'd been hoping to celebrate victory with him tonight, but he'd almost fallen asleep in the shower. By the time that she had showered he was so deeply asleep that she wondered if even the Kyuubi could wake him. Oh well, tomorrow night, then. Flipping her long red hair over her shoulder, she switched off the lights and wormed under the sheets beside Minato. Snuggling with him until she felt comfortable, she sighed in contentment and closed her eyes. While she waited for sleep, she let her thoughts wander. What a day. It sucked. But, I suppose it could have been worse. I made it through alright. Minato did fantastic and kicked tons of butt. And Naruto made it through, although the poor kid probably won't have enough points to make Chunin. Mikato's all beat up, but she's alive. Itachi's good but all stressed out over all the crap his dad's done and trying to fix it. Sasuke is okay, but, well, he will be okay, eventually, hopefully. So far Konoha isn't up in arms and out to kill Kitsune. Hopefully that won't change. I don't want to have to leave. And then there's... The bedroom door creaked and there were the sounds of bare feet pattering over the floorboards. Kushina continued to feign sleep as she felt the mattress shift as a small body crawled onto it. The intruder squirmed and clawed his way between her and Minato underneath the sheets and then fell still. Her nose twitched at Naruto's scent and she smiled. He's a bit old to be sleeping with mommy and daddy, but I'll let him get away with it this time. As soon as her son's breathing slowed into sleep, she gently stroked his hair and felt her eyes tearing up a bit. This is how it was always supposed to be. She moved her hand to grasp Minato's over Naruto's small sleeping form and sighed happily. Well, better late than never. Chapter 61, Epilogue. Epilogue. Uzumaki Mito strolled along Konoha's streets as the sun crept towards its zenith. The air was growing chilly and was filled with the sounds of shouted instructions, hammers pounding nails, and saws slicing wood. The invasion 1 month prior had left a lot of damage in its wake and the craftsmen and genin of the village were busy repairing it. She wore her usual drab, simple clothing and as she shuffled along she drew no notice from the villagers that she shared the streets with. The civilians had no idea who or what she was and she was perfectly content with that. Few ninja noticed or knew her either, and that was also fine. This was her last day in Konohagakure no Sato and she wanted no interruptions. Her first stop was the Hokage Tower. She stopped under a tree across the open square from it and admired the massive structure. Gray eyes traced over the claw-topped tower, the red siding, the kanji for fire, and remembered a time when it was all just a dream, a sloppy sketch on scratch paper that might never be realized. Turning her head, she could see the stone faces. There were so many more than there were the day that she had left the Leaf and ended her life as Senja Mito. It had been a little over 250 years since the founding of the village and humans had short lives, especially ninja living in unsettled times, so she shouldn't have been startled by so many new Hokages staring down at her. And yet a part of her was. It really has been a long time, hasn't it? Shaking her head, she moved on, taking a long and winding route through the village. She took care to visit the lands of each of the great clans so that she could take a moment and remember old friends and acquaintances long gone. And she also thought of how the places had changed and the new people that inhabited them. In the beginning, when the clans had first gathered here, each clan kept to themselves in their own part of the embryonic village. It was the imprint of the end of the hidden clans era, where every ninja family was out for itself, fighting each other for land, work, and survival. They didn't completely trust each other back then and so kept concentrated for security and comfort. It was different now. For many of the clans, there was no set boundary to where they lived. Yamanakas, Akimichis, Naras, Sarutobis, Senjus, and dozens of smaller clans could be found living side by side anywhere in the village. The Inyazuka and Aburame tended to live closer to each other, but only the Hyuga and the Uchiha truly lived the same as their ancestors had at the dawn of the leaf. The Hyuga seemed static, completely unchanged from when Mito had last experienced them. They weren't any better, and they weren't any worse. That seal that Mito had never really liked was still used, unmodified. She understood the rationale behind its creation and use, but understanding didn't lead to liking. But perhaps with the way that the current clan head was dragging his heels on caging one of his daughters and confirming the other as his heir made her wonder if the Hyuga's ironclad traditions might finally be bending. The Uchiha were slightly worse if anything. She had hoped that after experiencing Madara's madness they would eventually mellow out after the sting of his shame had faded. But that had not been the case. Destroying the victims of the curse that their dishonored ancestor had brought to their land had become almost like a holy mission for them, an obsession. But now, she mused as she paused outside of the gates of the Uchiha district, perhaps there is new hope for change. After the invasion, the Uchiha had retreated to their district in some disarray. They were furious at the treatment of their leader and of the things that had been said about the Kyuubi. And they were frightened that they might lose their control over the military police and the mark that had been left on Fugaku's neck. But while most remained loyal to Fugaku and his view of things, some seemed to be gravitating to the heir, Itachi, and were being to question things. A few days previously, Itachi had come and shared tea with her. The serious young man had wanted to know what she could tell him of his dreaded ancestor. He listened intently to all of her stories and never protested or argued, even when what she said contradicted what he had been taught. When he left, he even tried to apologize for what Madara had done. "I think I like him," she decided as she moved on. "He's very serious, but he's open-minded. He isn't much like his father and he's nothing like Madara. Perhaps he'll be able to bring down the Uchiha's walls and guide his clan down a less zealous path." Thinking of Itachi and the Uchiha, her mind was inevitably drawn to the past and Madara. She'd never liked him, even when he'd been relatively stable and sane. She had never understood why Hashirama-kun had respected him so much or tried so hard to befriend the arrogant bastard. She hated him for all the mad things he'd done once his eyesight had started to fail, the curse that he'd brought and forced on others, and all the suffering he'd caused. Damn him and damn whatever ancestor of his might have possibly spawned the Kyuubi no Yoko. Forcing away the old surge of anger, Mito continued on her way and turned her thoughts to more pleasant subjects. She thought of Tsunade, her descendant, and the meetings that they'd had. She felt some regret for how she'd almost tormented the blonde woman to get her to return to Konoha, but there just hadn't been the time to try more gentle coaxing methods. Conflict was coming to the leaf and she knew that Tsunade's legendary medical abilities would be needed. But even if there hadn't been a need to find Tsunade, though, Mito would have sought her out. She was curious to see what had become of her branch of the Senju and it wasn't healthy or beneficial for Tsunade to run away from her wounds the way that she had been. Since the support of her teammate, Jiraiya, or the freedom granted by her old mentor, the Hokage, seemed enough to straighten her descendant out, Mito felt that it was her turn to try. When Mito started giving Tsunade the explanations that she had promised, her descendant hadn't believed her. Mito had had to show her dozens of lost hidden passages, scrolls, and seals before the blonde woman had been able to accept her story. And then, understandably, she'd been less than happy with some of the implications of her tale. "So you're telling me that I'm part demon? After so many generations without any fresh infusion of Kitsune blood, you're just as human as any shinobi, Tsunade-chan." Her feet carried her through a peaceful park, the same one where she had observed the invasion. Many small children played on the playground equipment while their parents watched them, while couples and small groups strolled along the paths or enjoyed picnics by the side of the pond. Everyone sought to take a little time and enjoy the weather while it was still fair, but not all park goers were happy. Mito paused as her gray eyes landed on a black-haired boy huddled in the shadows at the base of a large tree. Young Sasuke looked profoundly unhappy as he watched younger children play without a care in the world. The fox woman found that she couldn't blame him one bit. The theory was that since his curse mark had been active at the moment of Orochimaru's death, instead of it going permanently dormant like it had for the rest, it remained at least partially active. The mark that had been the center of his curse was gone, leaving the supernatural energy that sparked his transformations to sit in his chakra coils just like it was thought to for werewolves. No one knew what the long-term effects on him would be, whether he could spread it by biting, or if any children he might father could inherit it, and so his future was murky and uncertain. Poor thing. It reminded her of her own struggle to decide whether or not she would bear children or adopt orphans after she'd married her husband so long ago. It had been dangerous enough to live so prominently within a village full of hunters out to exterminate her species. Birthing Hanyo children would have blown her cover and probably would have led to a quick death. But, in the end, she had risked it importing an Uzumaki midwife, excluding everyone else including her husband from the birthing room, and devising seals to brand her children, and later her grandchildren, with so that their demonic traits would never show. As she watched the melancholy boy, a smile came to her face when she saw Uchiha Mikoto approach him and coax him into the sunlight and towards a picnic with Kushina and Naruto on a nearby hill. "Have hope, young Sasuke," she silently advised as she started walking again. "Your future is uncertain, but not bleak. If you are strong, if you trust in your precious people, if you fight off your doubts, I believe you will be just fine." Her thoughts then shifted to her current favorite relative, Kushina. She was happy that the girl had made it through the battle, that she was reunited with her adorable son, and that she had her mate back. And she was also pleased that her brothers weren't causing her too much grief over her unorthodox little family. There was a brief twinge of guilt towards the boy. Yet again she wished that she hadn't just watched him and thought of her long-dead children and grandchildren when he'd still lived in Uzushiagaku or no Sato. At least he had found happiness here, though. It probably could have gone better for him, and he certainly could have done without the Uchiha's assassination attempt, but he was now an accepted part of Konoha's shinobi force. His future seemed promising and bright, and she hoped to see him again, maybe when he was older. She personally had no trouble with the young vixen's chosen mate. Her little meeting with the infamous Namikaze Minato had been quite interesting and rather enjoyable. His open, honest face, polite manners, and friendly nature had quickly dispelled any lingering fears that she'd harbored that he was anything like Madara. The information that he'd been able to share with her about werewolves had also been quite enlightening. "I do hope he was able to get those leftover wolves from the invasion safely away," she thought as she browsed a few shops. "Those poor things deserve a chance. And what better place for them than with other lycanthropes?" It was disappointing that it had taken so long for some of the mysteries surrounding werewolves to be revealed. And it was horrible that so many generations of humans had been acting under so many false assumptions that so many victims of the curse had suffered and killed themselves when it hadn't been necessary. But now, she fervently hoped, things regarding werewolves would change at last, and for the better. And it's not just werewolves that are getting a more positive spin, she smiled as she checked some prices. Kitsune are finally getting the benefit of the doubt. I wonder if Hiruzen was serious about letting a Kitsune teach some demon lore classes. The disguised vixen made a few purchases before continuing on to her final destination. The current Hokage, she decided, was a good man. He was old and tired and more than ready to retire, but if he couldn't find a successor he could keep up his post for at least another decade before he had to give it up. Mito idly wondered whether he would be able to persuade Jiraiya or Tsunade to take up the hat, or if he would find a way to get Minato into the position. A werewolf Kage, now that would be something. As she was about to bypass the memorial stones she noticed a small group of shinobi clustered there. Hatake Kakashi stared at the black stone that bore the names of his lost teammates, his one visible eye unfocused in deep thought. Namikaze Minato stood nearby dressed in Jonin gear instead of Umbu armor, his blue eyes flickering over all the names that he knew. And the white-haired Jiraiya waited a few feet back, watching the both of them solemnly. "Well," Jiraiya said suddenly as he strode forward and threw his arms around the younger men's shoulders. "I think we've been here long enough. Let's go get drunk." "It's the middle of the day," Kakashi pointed out blandly. "You know I don't drink," Minato replied with a frown. And I was going to meet up with Kushina and Naruto after lunch. Who cares what time it is? Jiraiya snorted cheerfully. And what are you afraid of, Minato? Think you're going to go mark some territory and howl at the sky? Sensei. Mito swallowed a giggle and left down a half-forgotten trail. I do hope Minato gets around to formalizing his relationship with Kushina-chan. It would make her very happy. And if Kenjiro or any of her brothers decides to interfere, well, I'll just have to straighten them out for my dear great-great-grandniece, won't I? It had once been a paved path, but many stones were now missing and parts of it were so overgrown the trail almost disappeared. Unruly bushes and low-hanging tree branches made the going challenging. But with her memory as her guide she followed it all the way to a small graveyard that had been swallowed by the forest. With slow steps she weaved around tree trunks and stepped over toppled grave markers. Any gravestones that were still standing were badly weathered so that the characters chiseled into them were mostly illegible. And when she reached a dark gray stone leaning up against a fat tree trunk, she stopped and knelt. Sorting through her earlier purchases she used a kunai to dig up a few ugly weeds on the grave and plant bulbs that would flower in the spring. She lit incense sticks and inhaled the aromatic smoke with a faint smile. Then she closed her eyes, prayed, and remembered. It was late autumn, the trees were all almost bare, and it was cold enough that the gray cloud overhead would probably produce snow. A young man, 16 years old, dressed in black and red, with tanned skin, dark eyes, and long black hair, stood at the base of a dormant cherry tree. Sitting on a boulder not far from him was a girl about his age with pale skin, gray eyes, coppery red gold hair done up in twin buns, and dressed in a fine kimono of green, black, and gold and patterned with leaves. I hate autumn, she pouted and snapped open a fan decorated with white spirals on a rich blue background. Everything turns an ugly brown and dies. The leaves turn such beautiful colors before they end, though, the boy said as he traced one hand over the cherry tree's dark bark. For a little while, it's like all the trees are on fire. But then they all go brown and fall off and the trees all look like skeletons. She huffed, holding the open fan over the lower half of her face. And then winter comes and it's even worse. It gets so cold and dark for so long, and sometimes it even snows. What about spring and summer? He asked curiously. In summer it gets much too hot. She frowned and briefly fanned herself as if remembering a blazing heat wave. But spring is the best. Sometimes it's chilly and it can rain a lot, but there's all the birds singing, all the new babies, the new leaves, all the flowers. She sighed wistfully and glanced at the barren tree her companion was touching. I love flowers. He watched her for a moment before grinning. Would you like me to make the sakura bloom? You can't make that tree bloom. She laughed. Care to bet on that? He challenged. Certainly. She smirked. I'd love to have a slave for a week. Well, prepare to become my slave. He boasted. Sure, whatever, she scoffed. He ignored her and placed both palms on the tree trunk with an expression of deep concentration. For a moment, nothing appeared to happen. Then buds began to swell on the ends of twigs, a scattering of fresh leaves unfurled, and then countless delicate blossoms with pale pink petals opened, filling the chilly air with a sweet perfume. I win, the teenage boy declared smugly. The girl was too busy gaping in wonder to reply. A breeze tickled the back of Mito's neck like ghostly fingers and she opened her eyes again to stroke the rough surface of the gravestone with a sad smile. I'm sorry, Hashi-kun, she whispered. I don't mean to make you wait so long, but I promised you that I'd look out for your village for the rest of my life. I can't very well cheat to meet up with you again sooner and properly honor that promise now, can I? So please, wait for me, I have so many new stories to tell you. That's it for part 18. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.